During World War II, the United States and Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers. However, the relationship between the two nations was a tense one. After the war ended, these grievances ripened into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust and enmity. While in such a hostile atmosphere, no single party was entirely to blame for the Cold War. In fact, some historians believed it was inevitable. By the time World War II ended, most American officials agreed that the best defense against the Soviet threat was a strategy called containment. In 1946, a political force committed fanatically to believe that with the US, there could be no permanent agreement between the parties that disagree. As a result, America's only choice was the long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. President Harry Truman agreed that it must be the policy of the United States. Thus, he declared before Congress in 1947 to support free people who are resisting to attempt subjugation by outside pressures. This way of thinking would shape Americans' foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The containment strategy also provided the rationale for an unprecedented arms buildup in the United States. In 1950, a National Security Council report known as NSC 68 had echoed Truman's recommendation that the country use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere it seemed to be occurring. To that end, the report called for a 4-fold increase in defense spending. In particular, the American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the ones that had been used to end World War II. Thus began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atomic bomb of their own. In response, President Truman announced the United States would build an even more destructive atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb. As a result, the stakes of the Cold War were perilously high. And for conclusion, the Cold War was a constant presence in Americans' everyday lives.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for the Cold War competition. On October 4th, 1957, Russia for Traveler launches the first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. The launch came as a surprise, and not a pleasant one, to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension of the grand American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. In addition, this demonstration of the overwhelming power seemingly capable of delivering a nuclear warhead into the United States airspace made gathering intelligence about Soviet military activities particularly urgent. In 1958, the US launched its own satellite, the Explorer 1, designed by the US Army, and what came to be known as the space race was underway that same year. Still, the Soviets were one step ahead, launching the first man into space in April 1961. In response, July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong of NASA's Apollo 11 mission became the first man to set foot on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Almost as soon as he took office, President Richard Nixon began to implement a new approach to international relations. Instead of viewing the world as a hostile, bipolar place, he suggested why not use diplomacy instead of military action to create more poles. To that end, he encouraged the United Nations to recognize the Communist Chinese government, and after a trip there in 1972, he began to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At the same time, he adopted a policy of détente, or relaxation, towards the Soviet Union, which resulted to the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, which prohibited the manufacturing of nuclear missiles by both sides and took a step toward reducing the decade-old threat of nuclear war. But the Cold War did not end in response to severe economic and geopolitical problems. Finally, in 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the decades-long Cold War, was destroyed, just over 2 years after Reagan had challenged the Soviet premier in a speech at Brandenburg Gate in Berlin.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
By 1991, the Soviet Union itself had fallen apart. The Cold War was over.